Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to welcome you to the next of our speakers for the Enchanted Technology Festival for the summer. David Lobser is our first speaker for the Augmented Storytelling Institute, which is going to continue over the next 3 weeks. I just wanted to mention a little bit about it, that some of you are watching on the stream, and I'm really excited. Do subscribe if you can, so that someday we get free captions. But our institute is a mixture of sort of workshops, speakers, hands-on making, training, and at the SETI lab at Portland State. And we will have a show in mid-September. Go to our Eventbrite page, go to the website, seti.institute, CETI.institute, to sort of join, learn more about the workshops, sign up. We hope to see you there at some of them. And in particular, I am really excited that David will be joining us in person here next week to teach workshops for a couple of days. So if you're inspired by this talk, come learn how to make some of these things. But I'm going to say briefly, introduce David briefly. He is this amazing artist, technologist, developer, makes lots of really just complicated, amazing, immersive media experiences of various kinds. He's going to show you an example, but his work most recently is focused on therapeutic VR, and he's going to talk a lot more about that in the next hour. Some of you who came to our Winter Light Festival would have seen Cosmic Sugar, and go back to our YouTube stream and hear David talk about that, and another XR sort of activism takeover of a MoMA gallery earlier this year. So David's work has been very inspirational for many of us, and hopefully you will sort of find your way to the lab, to his workshop, to this talk, and I'm really, really excited and honored and delighted that you can share your ideas with us, David. So take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to come out. I'll be there, I think Tuesday and Thursday are my workshops, and they're both going to be quite long. One's going to be sort of very much introductory, and the other one's going to go from semi-advanced to very advanced very quickly, I think. So I think based on the people that are there. So yeah, I started off as an animator, spent 10 or 15 years in the visual effects and animation industry, and I directed short films and commercials, and moved into procedural art and being a developer when I went to ITP in New York. It's part of NYU and Tisch, and that's where I met Scott, and we've been working together ever since then. I've been recently focused on therapeutic virtual reality, so that's VR for healthcare, and it's a very new space that is very far from maturing. There are a lot of challenges in that space, but there's also a lot of really strong evidence that as far as use cases go, VR is very powerful in the therapeutic space. It's like a really good analgesic. It sort of distracts you in a way that actually reduces pain, as well as opioids can, and that's just one use case. Great for distraction therapy. If you want to give a child a vaccine, you can put them in VR, and like instead of getting jabbed with a needle, there's like a bunny kissing them on the arm and stuff like that. I'm working with a company right now that is in the oncology space. So that project is about getting people to calm down when they are getting radiation therapy, and we're starting to talk about how to make chemotherapy less boring and terrible. So there's just a lot of really interesting things to do, and I mean, there's a big point of friction with hospitals and headsets. It's just kind of a tricky technology, and nurses have to get trained, and there's just like a lot that has to happen before it's really going to be widely accepted. But I think it's going to be a really important part of healthcare settings in the future. So I've been working in the space for 3 years, and I started off doing it in a fairly DIY kind of way. I was introduced to a ketamine infusion clinic in Manhattan, and they do sort of sessions of ketamine with people, and they wanted to create a better setting for people. I guess I'm already like launching into the talks. Maybe I'll pause for a second and just like take things one step at a time through my slide deck. So actually, if you want to just like pop right into the slides, I can kind of start going through things in a more structured way.
And for those of you watching, if you have questions, add them to your comments on YouTube or our Discord channel, and we'll get to them at the end. So yeah, thank you, David.
Cool. So it's up on the screen. It's playing. The slide deck's ready to go. Okay, cool. So yeah, this is the name of the project. It's called Visitations, and it is actually an app that you can download for various headsets. It's on the App Lab for the Quest, and it's on Steam. Visitations are spaces that are designed to improve the setting for patients undergoing ketamine infusion therapy. The idea is people who are at this clinic are in a very clinical setting. It's gray and beige, and there's fluorescent lights and machines beeping and stuff like that. And it's been known for a long time that the place that you're in when you have some kind of intense mind-altering experience is a very important part of what that experience will provide for you. So a much nicer space for people to have these experiences. I think I went over some of this already. So yeah, I started animation and visual effects around the same time that I was working with this ketamine infusion clinic. I also started a digital art spa in Brooklyn called Luxury Escapism with Tyler Pridgeon. And these are some images from the spa. It was a relaxing space designed to sort of create these sensory experiences that would provide a similar kind of experience that going to other kinds of spas would provide. So basically using VR and projections and audio installations and physical, like tactile things. We had a sound room that was a ASMR sound journey. The experience in the lower left is called rainbow therapy, and that's actually a vibrating waterbed with a strobe light that people can control. And I'm going to talk a bit about like why strobe lights are so interesting in the therapeutic space. So I continue to develop visitations there, and the way we set it up is that we had, I think, 10 Oculus Go headsets set up around the space, and people could come and just put the headset on and be in VR. We wanted that experience to have very little friction. I designed it for the patients in such a way that they wouldn't have to do anything, and it would be extremely easy for them, and we wanted to do it the same way with the spa. People could just sit down and put VR on. A lot of festivals or places that you might go to experience VR, like there's a lot of work that people need to do in terms of getting you set up and showing you how to use the headset and onboarding you, and we wanted to make it as simple as possible across the board. So this is a quick trailer. There is, I think it's not going to play audio, but this is okay. I was trying to turn down the audio because I kind of can't hear myself over the audio on my end, even though you can't hear it. But these are scenes that sort of run continuously, but they're always changing because they're procedurally generated. And they're designed to run on mobile, so they're simplified, but I did try to do my best to make the most out of the limitations of the technology. Okay. And I can share links. So yeah, visitationsvr.com has a lot of videos, full-length videos. There's some VR videos as well. If you're familiar with an artist named East Forest, he was responsible for a lot of the music in the app. He used to be Portland-based. Now he's Boise-based in Boulder, Utah. I'll talk about him a little bit more. So it was, yeah, Visitations came about fairly organically. I think it was actually, I think I was talking to Scott about like a very initial iteration of this app a very long time ago, sort of at the advent of this round of VR. And I kind of felt early on that VR was going to be this really interesting new medium, and that there was going to be a lot of room to experiment in a similar way that filmmakers were experimenting at different stages of the development of that technology, which is like, there's this new technology, it means it's a new art form. What can we do with this art form that's going to be new and interesting? And something that was really interesting to artists in the 70s was creating films that explored the flow of consciousness and kind of creating films that mirrored like the meandering path of our thoughts, basically. So it's not a thing people are quite as interested in now, but all of these artists were very prolific. They all got the National Endowment for the Arts used to fund projects like that back in the day. So there's a lot of interesting work there that's worth checking out. So ketamine is something people might be familiar with as a club drug. And a lot of people have kind of negative associations with it for various reasons. It's continues to be used, has been used a lot as a anesthetic. So if you give people enough ketamine, you can take out their gallbladder or whatever it is you need to do to them. It's very safe compared to other kinds of anesthetics. Other anesthetics will depress your breathing pretty easily, so you do need an anesthesiologist around if you're going to be putting somebody out with other kinds of medicine. With ketamine, it's hard to overdose people, so it's safe to give to kids, to animals, to whatever. It's only been in the last couple decades that people have been recognizing that it is incredibly powerful and effective as an antidepressant compared to SSRIs. So there was a lot of interest with ketamine for people who did not respond well to SSRIs and other kinds of antidepressants. And it's just been demonstrated to be significantly more effective in a shorter time span. So there is one kind of ketamine that is actually approved for depression, and it is kind of expensive, and there's a protocol for doing it. So you actually need to show up in a therapist's office, and you need to stay there for 2 hours after doing it with the therapist. But ketamine's been around for a long time, and it's a Schedule III drug, and basically any doctor can prescribe it for off-label reasons. So most people that do get prescribed ketamine now are getting off-label prescriptions for it. So the first study, or at least the first study that I'm aware of, that used ketamine and virtual reality at the same time was called Snow World, and it's been cited a lot. It was made for people who were burn patients, and they need to debride the skin. So they're basically scrubbing off dead tissue, and it's incredibly painful, and they wanted to figure out ways to make that a less horrendous experience. So they put people in a VR experience where these snowmen are throwing snowballs at the patients. And they combine that with ketamine as the analgesic. They actually measured the level of enjoyment that patients had with the experience, and people actually enjoyed having the experience. So it wasn't just completely horrible as it is for, it's like for most of them. I mean, if you can imagine, it's just like it's pain, and there's like nothing to do. All you can focus on is the pain. So being in this experience, all of your senses are distracted. You're in this completely different place, and your experience of the pain is connected to being in the snowball fight, as opposed to the experience of having your flesh literally removed. So yeah, that study was an important study in the history of VR in medicine. So for the study that I did with Manhattan Restorative Health Sciences, which is the ketamine clinic in Midtown, patients received 3 infusions in 1 week. First, they did one with just ketamine, and the second one was with VR, and the third one they had a choice for. And most people chose to do the third one with VR, and most people preferred it and had very effusively positive things to say about it. So these are a few of the comments. Definitely VR is not for everybody. Some people prefer to just have their eyes closed or listen to music. You know, some people found VR to be oppressive in various ways or at certain times, but for the most part, people found that having the experience in VR was preferable by far. So my hope is that, you know, by creating these experiences, I can make themselves better in some ways. So there is a quality of VR just as a medium that's extremely effective. You know, just the fact that you are transported to another space and away from your body has its own effects. So in some ways, almost any VR experience you have is going to be effective on some level. So I think that the goal for a therapeutic artist would be to enhance those natural abilities that come from VR as a medium. So something that we had to consider with the clinic, and something that I also brought over to the spot, was the idea that people were going to come in with no experience with VR. They weren't going to be able to interact with anything. We didn't want to have to worry about giving them controllers. The amount of ketamine they were doing in these sessions was between 0.5 and 1 milligram per kilogram, which is actually quite a lot. So it can be like pretty intense for people, and it can be fairly disorienting. So we didn't want to do anything that was going to be difficult or would require any training at all. So we did aim to keep things fairly simple. We also wanted to let people sit or lay down in whatever way they were comfortable with, so the experience reorients to them. Yeah, like I said, no interaction. So these are some of the ways or some of the tools that a therapeutic artist can use to help people heal themselves. So I have awe, meditation, catharsis, distraction, entrainment, framing. So framing is the idea that you're in pain, but the pain is coming from snowballs that are hitting you, so it's fun. And nature, just in general. Actually, a study just came out recently, I think from Finland, where they showed that being in nature in VR was just as good as being out in nature in reality, which is really interesting. So it's sort of been known for a long time that being exposed to natural environments is therapeutic for people, which makes sense. But the question is, what is it about nature that is therapeutic? So, you know, because it could be the air, it could be something that's happening on a level that, you know, might be hard to measure. It could be just like context, like being away from a computer, being away from other things that are distracting you. But it might just be about the shapes. It might be about a connection to fractals. So I think that's an interesting question that might be worth exploring. Like, how far can you get away from nature? Like, what qualities of nature can you use and still have it be as therapeutic as a direct simulation of something natural? So actually, I want to talk about awe as well. So awe is an interesting one. There was a paper called Designing Awe in Virtual Reality, an experimental study. And they described awe as a complex emotion encompassing the two main appraisal themes of vastness, which is the perception of being in front of either perceptually or conceptually grand or vast stimuli, and the need for accommodation, which is the urge to adjust mental frames according to new incoming information. So people, I don't know if you've heard of the overview effect, but there's a thing that happens when astronauts go into space. They have an experience of awe of looking down on the planet Earth, and it's this vast, complex thing, and this experience of awe happens when you need to adjust yourself to fully take in how amazing it is that we live on this little pebble in the middle of this sea of emptiness. I also think that the joy of fractals kind of comes from the same place, because fractals spin off to infinity, and you kind of can't take it all in at once. There's something very intense and magical about fractals that I think we're just sort of naturally clued into, because we are kind of made of fractals, and our lives and our relationships are also kind of fractal-like. Most natural things have some fractal elements. So meditation is a little different than meditative. So meditation is kind of about aligning your thoughts to be about one thing. So typically that would be the breath. You kind of train your subminds to all be on the same page via the practice of meditation, whereas something that's meditative might help you sort of get distracted and get a little bit relaxed, maybe in order to get to the place where you can more easily meditate. Catharsis is, of course, something that comes out of drama, and is sort of getting into a feeling and sort of feeling through something, like some event. Distraction is about just being in a different place. And entrainment comes from strobing, like either auditory or visual strobing. There is a suggestion, although the research is, I think, a little mixed on this point. But visual strobing definitely does something. People have seizures when they look at strobe lights, but it also does things to the brains of people who are not epileptic. And you can use strobe lights to help people get into more meditative states, or make them more anxious if you use the wrong frequency. All kinds of things. Actually, strobe lights are things that they used with rats in a recent study, where they actually broke up amyloid plaques in the brains of rats that were bred to react to light in a certain way, and 40 hertz strobing actually got rid of their Alzheimer's and helped them live longer. So strobing is there in Visitations a bit. It's like I wanted to release it broadly, and strobing is not something that everybody likes. So the strobing in Visitations is mostly pretty subtle. There is one scene that I just decided not to worry about, and just went ahead and made it very stroby. I don't think that Meta publishes any guidelines for strobing, so I have a warning for people that might be epileptic. But I tend to have strobing that is at 10 hertz, which is like alpha waves. So that's good for focus, like kind of calm, like attention kind of states. And then 4 hertz is like theta waves. So that's for sleep and relaxation. So I kind of like stayed in that realm for the most part. With screen displays, you have to have like your strobing is connected to the frame rate of the device. So really the fastest you can strobe a typical VR headset would be 30 hertz. So you wouldn't be able to make people live longer with a typical VR headset. So tunnels and spirals are things that people respond to. There was a scientist named Heinrich Kluver who was doing a lot of experiments about 100 years ago with mescaline. I think it was Bayer Pharmaceuticals that was actually manufacturing synthetic mescaline 100 years ago. That was, one of the waves of psychedelic research that maybe not a lot of people are quite as familiar with. But he was cataloging the kinds of hallucinations he had, and he came up with a way to categorize the hallucinations, and he called them form constants. And he described tunnels and funnels, spirals, lattices, honeycombs and triangles, and cobwebs. And what he intuited from his experience of these kinds of hallucinations in that state is that they were not like stuck in his eye. They were not like eyeball effects, but they were actually brain effects and have something to do with the structures of our brains and the way that these different medicines sort of affect them. And he got that because as he looked around the room, it's like the patterns would kind of stay where they were, like inside of the room. So it is a matter of speculation as to like why exactly we see these kinds of patterns. And there are, some theories about the way that the cells in our brains are arranged and how it can lead to those kinds of patterns, but it isn't exactly known right now. So symmetry is also sort of a thing that you are taught to avoid in art school because in some ways it's boring, like having even balance. But if you're trying to make something that's easy on the eyes and easy to approach, symmetry is kind of an easy thing. It's another thing that we respond to as people. Symmetrical faces are considered to be more attractive. Symmetrical bodies are considered to be healthier. And lots of cultures make use of radial symmetry, like with mandalas. Carl Jung famously used mandalas in order to gain psychological insight and self-understanding. So something that I think virtual reality creators are doing a better job with these days, but especially in the early days of VR, when people were first exploring 360 video, a lot of projects came along where you just didn't know where to look, and I always found that to be extremely stressful, like feeling like I was missing something that was happening behind me. So something that I do with Visitations is just like give a very clear place to look and frame the entire experience around that. So not all the scenes are perfectly symmetrical, but they do sort of create a framing for a very obvious place that you're supposed to be resting your eyes. So this is, kind of about just like transitions that are slow, but not too slow. So you can use your breath as an object of meditation. Every breath is the same, but every breath is different. So in the same way, I wanted to have things in the environments that would sort of pulsate at different frequencies and would line up in different ways at different times. So procedural generation just means, in the case of Visitations, that some scenes more than others are fairly different each time you come back and see it. So the idea is like, because everything is made in a game engine and runs in real time, there's no reason that it has to stay the same each time. So things are always a little bit different. And then I already talked a bit about fractals. They are easy in the sense that they are like almost any fractal is real pretty right off the bat. They're challenging in a sense that they can also be cheesy. So if you're working with fractals as part of an art practice, you also have to be aware of people's resistance to things that are too easy at the same time. So there is a little bit of a balancing act, I would say. So this is actually made with, this is actually not in Visitations right now, but this was built with render textures in Unity, and the render texture is very simple. Actually, it's just recursive. It breaks an image into quadrants and then repeats the same image into each of those quadrants. Binaural Beats work in a similar way that visual strobing does. Binaural beats generally refers to the idea that if you play a tone in one ear and a slightly different tone in the other ear, let's say 440 in the left ear and 430 in the right ear, you'll hear a 10 hertz sort of strobing. And there's a suggestion that that strobing actually happens in the brain. You can also create something called isochronic beats, which is basically the same thing, but they're coming out of one speaker, or they're together, basically. And that sort of creating those beats, in theory, works in the same way that the strobing does, and that it can kind of entrain your brain to sort of be on a certain frequency. And there's, if you look up binaural beats, there's lots and lots of YouTube videos and music that incorporate binaural beats, more or less. So a lot of people find binaural beats to be annoying, as much as strobe lights can be annoying. So a lot of people that do incorporate binaural beats make them pretty subtle. I think the jury's out whether or not the intensity of the beats makes a difference. I kind of think it does. So if I happen to be meditating with binaural beats, I like them to be a little bit more forward. So it's working with East Forest. They recommend, like, he's been on a tear lately. He's incredibly prolific and big in the psychedelic scene. He does lots of ceremonies, and that's actually how he started. Sort of when he started making music, he was doing it for ceremonial experiences with people. And then these are some of the other people who made some audio. So in addition to music and voiceover, there's also audio that is connected to elements in the world, and that helps a lot with immersion. Oops, did I step forward too much? Let's see. Okay. So yeah, if you can see something, it becomes much more real if you can also hear what that thing is doing. So some scenes in Visitations are a little bit more passive on that level, but there are other scenes where it's like audio is very clearly tied to things that are happening. And I think that makes it much more powerful in terms of feeling like you're really there. So something else that is very interesting to explore with VR is scent and vibration, temperature, fans, all of these things also like really make you feel like you're there. I'm especially interested in continuing to explore vibroacoustics. There's lots of ways to do that. You can take transducers and attach them to beds and chairs. You can take transducers and just put them inside of pillows and rest them on your chest. If you've heard of subpacks, those are transducers that, I think there's one in the front and one in the back, and you put it on like a vest. And there's sort of another realm of vibroacoustics, which involves using small, like arrays of small motors. So there are some vests and chairs you can get that have tiny motors that go down your back or along your front, and those can vibrate you in more specific ways. VRX by Brennan Spiegel is a book that covers a lot of topics in therapeutic VR. It's a fun book. His personality comes across really well in that book, and he makes it fun to read about all the studies that have been done in that space. So some people just respond badly to VR still, for a lot of different reasons. Most people don't. If you design your VR well, if the frame rate's good, if you're not jerking people around with the camera, like most people are not going to get motion sickness if you've done a good job with that. You need to onboard people. There's a lot of stuff that has to get set up. Like I talked about this earlier, it's like this is a challenge with working with large institutions that have bureaucracy. You do need kind of like a lot of things to align for a VR project to work well. Even at this late date, VR still feels like a bit Rube Goldbergian at times. So these are some of the challenges of being a therapeutic artist. So these are, these are the things that an artist brings um, to this space. A lot of people working in therapeutic VR are scientists and engineers and doctors, and there are fewer artists that are like really extremely interested in focusing on this space. So it's pretty early, so there's not a mature industry around it, but there is definitely a lot of room for um, artists to come in and create experiences. So these are things I'm interested in experimenting with going forward. So other medicines, I'm working with a company called Atai Life Sciences right now. They are one of the big drug discovery companies in the psychedelic space. And we are working on an experience that's similar to Visitations in a lot of ways, but it was made not to be experienced during, but before, as a way to get people to focus and calm down before they do their 5-hour psilocybin analog. If you have your own VR headset and you're going to the dentist and you're going to get a filling, I recommend bring your VR headset. It makes it a lot more pleasant. So these are some other ones: infusions, painful procedures. Teletherapy is something I'm very interested in. There's obviously been a lot more of that since the pandemic started. And I think that exactly how to use the affordances of VR is something that sort of remains to be determined. It's like, do you represent the therapist as a person sitting there in front of you? Are they a disembodied voice? Are they a glowing orb? Can the therapist take you on some kind of journey? There's a lot of really interesting, I think, things that could come from the teletherapy space. Second. So these are these are things to consider when designing experiences. So the hypnosis versus hypnotic and mental imagery versus imagery is something to think about if you are leading something on a meditation where you are asking them to do things like close their eyes and imagine things. Then maybe VR is not the right medium for that. I have done VR meditations where people ask you to imagine the color red, but I'm looking at the color green, for instance. So the way hypnosis works and the way a lot of guided imagery works is like the power comes from you imagining things, and that's a huge and amazing and really important space. So I don't think that VR, VR can kind of replace that, but I think that VR has other more interesting uses than just trying to kind of be a replacement for people's imagination, because people's imagination is always going to be, more vast and florid than anything you can show them. So I kind of like the term mindfultainment as a term for this space. It's like there's a world of music and activities and events that are kind of there to make it easier to get to a place where you can engage with meditation or engage with other practices. There are schools of thought that say, meditation should be somewhat austere and anything else is a distraction. But distractions can be okay, and they can kind of soften you up for getting to a place where you can maybe do some more serious work if that's something you're interested in. So flow is something that I explore more with Cosmic Sugar, but that is... And it's definitely not something that I'm exploring with Visitations right now. Visitations is much more lean back experiences that are intended to conjure flow or need to be engaging. But something that can kind of, create a sense of engagement is also just from continuous novelty. I came across a study that talked about singing bowls and the power of singing bowls and how well they worked, but the study did say that they worked best on people who had never had the experience before and didn't work as well after they did it a few times. So creating new experiences is also something that can help with engagement and help with people sort of getting deeper into a place where they can be calm, distracted, whatever you're trying to create for people. So I guess I had the slide because it's sort of a list of questions and ideas that I'm kind of engaging with while I'm making this stuff, because it's still all very early, and anybody who's working in the space is making things up to a certain degree. So some more questions. Do 360 videos work as well as real-time graphics? Is something that I'm not sure how much has actually been tested. One issue with real-time graphics can be, putting people in a place where what they're looking at feels like a video game. And for a lot of people, that might be fine. But if you feel like you're in a place that's very synthetic, but is not supposed to feel synthetic, I think that can raise resistance in audience members. So easygoing or challenging is kind of like, do you want to be on a relaxing beach, or do you want to be climbing a steep mountain? So different people want different things, and different people need different things, and you can present these variations in different ways. So maybe it's not, maybe you're not literally climbing the side of a mountain, but maybe the strobing is more intense, or maybe the tunnel that you're in is deeper, or you're moving faster through it. So some people like to be pushed a little bit, and some people need to feel really safe. So realistic imagery versus illustrative imagery. Visitations is very illustrative, in part because of the limitations of production and headsets. That image on the top is from Supernatural, and you can go out and take photos and model geometry and make things fairly photorealistic even on mobile headsets, but it is difficult and time consuming, and as an individual artist, doing things that are more like that middle image, which is also beautiful and tasteful, also much easier to do for a very small team or an individual. So these are some things I want to do in the future. I want to work with more therapists. So I'm working with a psychologist right now with the oncology study. And so with Visitations, we've shown that people are satisfied with it and like it. Whether it's effective or not is another matter. So actually studying effectiveness is actually very difficult and can be very expensive. Apparently, $500,000 would not be unusual to actually find out if something like Visitations was actually effective. I would like to add the ability for people to kind of onboard and offboard by talking about what they want to get out of the experience and listening to what the experience was like later. Sort of revisiting this stuff can be an important part of a therapeutic process. I just did my first live performance with a group on Sunday, and it went very well, and I'm going to keep doing those, and I'm hoping to network them, and maybe I will even do some version of that out in Portland if there are enough headsets around. So maybe I feel like we're running out of time. Maybe should I leave like 5 or 10 minutes for questions and chatting at the end? I can also just
keep there's a little bit. If you have something else you want to sort of add, absolutely go ahead and add it.
Okay. So biofeedback is something else that I am working with more now with one of my clients. This is kind of exciting. I figured out how to detect heartbeat just from the headset. So I can just sit there and with no other sensors, just a VR headset, it's like the headset's sensitive enough that you can actually detect your pulse, which is pretty cool. Pressure sensing, I think, is a really interesting one. Like, I would like to build an interface that you squeeze to make the experience more or less intense. There's a device called the HP Reverb G2 Omnicept Edition that has eye tracking built in, and it can detect your pupil dilation, which can tell you kind of how activated you are, and it also has a heart rate sensor. And I'm also interested in things that are not VR, so more strobe lights and more kind of dome displays I think are really interesting. And then in terms of augmented storytelling goes, I think that creating experiences that unfold over time could be really powerful. So when people do ketamine infusion sessions, they'll do sets of 5 or 6 typically over the course of a few weeks. So I think if you went back and like had experiences that changed and developed each time you went back, I think could really help with that too. So metaverse, could be some issues. I never met a verse that didn't want to steal all my private data, and maybe I don't want them knowing about my healthcare. So I was working with Scott on this project with HTC for the last 20 years. It's called Vive Dreaming. There is actually, like, chapter 1 is out, but they haven't really pushed it yet. It's like in stealth mode. 2 more chapters will be out, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. And then Atai and Cyber, and I did a little bit of work with Johns Hopkins, and that's where you can see it. And that's it. So happy to take questions.
Thank you, David. This was really, really interesting, and sort of I've never seen quite this sort of range of use for VR. I have a couple questions, but you talked a little bit about these experiences, and sometimes they're dramatic, the strobes and the fractals, the complexity of it, and sometimes they're calming and meditative, and I guess it depends on the patient. But you've talked about like working with hospitals or doctors and the sort of issues with that, with sort of medical bureaucracy really, and like the logistics and all of the systemic issues with that. But I'm wondering, like, have you thought about, or have you informally tried it on patients who might be more receptive outside of the medical system? And I'm thinking of like 6 months of insane chemotherapy that I went through, and then I was done with the infusion. I got to go home, but actually, like, it would have been nice to have something distracting for those next few hours when the stuff is still in your system, but you're not in the hospital. It would have been lovely to have something not to look around that room with and distracting at the hospital, but I would have loved something even after I got home. And I'm wondering if there are sort of patients groups and other groups that would like thinking of this as something supportive of patients, less medication, or that's whether you've explored that.
Yeah, I think chemo in particular is like very ripe for multi-user experiences, just because it is so boring. You're just sitting there like feeling awful, right? So yeah, I think that one in particular is would be an amazing place to be able to have shared experiences with other people while you're there, just even if it's like watching a movie together, and then like having a place where you can also like share your thoughts and like talk with each other. So that requires a lot of infrastructure, like right there. So that is something that I might be working on with with Rocket VR, which is the oncology startup. They're very interested in moving into that space. But yeah, I think you get to a good point too, which is like it's not just about the procedure, but it's about what happens afterwards. Because it's like maybe there's you go in for a procedure, it's like 15 minutes, you're in VR, okay, you were distracted from that, but maybe if you had done the experience beforehand to prepare yourself a bit, maybe the experience would be easier. And then if you can sort of revisit that same place later, if there's lingering trauma, or if there's if you just like need to dip back into that place of like being able to calm yourself down, then having that before and after I think could be really powerful too. So those are also so the before experience is something that we're exploring with Rocket VR, which is like before you go into a session, like do a meditation, get used to like what's going to happen. There are VR experiences for kids who are going to have an MRI, for instance, and they actually do a VR simulation of the MRI. So it's like in a safe space, they know it's not real. And then when they go do it, they know what to expect because it's like unusual and like nobody can be like there with them when they do it. So yeah, I think that's a good point, that it's like it's not just about like during it, but before and after too.
Hello, I snuck in while you weren't looking. Nathan, I think you can take down the slides if you want to. I think we're just going to talk for a moment. So, okay. Hello, David. Thank you for the talk. It was awesome. Hello, I'm Scott. I'm sure everybody's heard from me a million times. So I have some questions. So as a person who's been kind of your guinea pig on some of these things for the last getting close to 10 years, something like that, like for all of these and like all the early VR things and all of the like initial kind of experiments that you were doing, I guess something I'm really interested in getting your perspective on is, very early on, you were very interested. As David mentioned, we met at ITP. David has a background in animation, but he really very quickly latched on to like real-time computer graphics versus these like static, unchanging rendered experiences. And part of the interest there is with real-time, you can have things that respond to you and be interactive, but you can also do things that are generative and that change every time. And it's been really interesting to watch you kind of shift your work over the years to sort of embrace that. And I think one of the things that's been interesting to see is I remember even 7 years ago, you were talking about these kinds of experiences or this kind of like playlist of experiences that you can go into. And I remember some of the very early concepts of it were almost like it was a music festival or something. It was almost like a Burning Man in VR or something, where you would have these different stages and these different environments. And I remember even doing some prototypes at that time. And in my mind, and correct me if I don't have the thread right, but I feel like the thread of Visitations is now kind of started with sort of some of that thinking. And what's really interesting to me is what began kind of seemingly in the realm of like music festival, Burning Man, Electric Daisy, Carnival, those kinds of things, there's a thread from that and the work you're doing in that realm now to this similar kinds of experiences, but with a totally different context, even if the purpose is the same. And so I'm really interested for the take on your journey from these sort of, as an artist, as a therapeutic artist, which is an interesting term to hear, taking you from these like shared musical fun, experiences to now being something that's therapeutic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of gets to an interesting tension that's just in the psychedelic community in general, which is, the reason that they were made illegal a long time ago is that people were having fun with them, and they were sort of starting to disrespect the government and sort of like authoritarian structures and things like that. There are all these like things that psychedelics open you up to. So this whole counterculture formed around them, and like this sort of party space basically. So everything fun became illegal. So now that it's like they're gaining acceptance again, I'd say like when Michael Pollan came out with his book How to Change Your Mind, it's like that sort of accelerated that significantly, because it's like, oh, suddenly like normal people can do this, and it's like interesting and helpful. And it turns out that all of these things that people are doing for fun and that because they enjoy them are actually beneficial and therapeutic. So the way that that's rolling out in the psychedelic space is that it's being very medicalized, and part of that is like, how do you get this to be approved by the powers that be? And that's to like study it in depth and get insurers to pay for it. So somebody has to profit off of this for like the institutions to like accept all of these things again. In terms of creating a nice experience for people who are having these therapeutic interventions, it's like, yeah, all the lessons are the same as like what's fun with games. Like, you want to be on the beach, like you want to do something exciting, like all like that stuff makes people feel good, and if something makes you feel good, it's going to help with therapeutic outcomes. So it's like, yeah, it's like pretty A to B in that sense. It's like, you make some tweaks, and there are some affordances and considerations for people who are in therapeutic settings, but you want to make people feel good, and you want to make beautiful experiences for them, and that's stuff is beauty is therapy, and art is therapy, and nature is therapy, and all that stuff goes together.
Well, so you mentioned the term setting, and I was thinking about that. There was a weird disconnect if you kind of read about psychedelic research over the years. There, in my mind, there were kind of two paths. There were people that understood. I'm sure you could speak more to this. That old idea of set and setting, and there were seemingly early psychedelic researchers that realized, like, oh, the context matters, the set and setting matters, and there were psychedelic researchers who did not realize that and were administering various psychedelic substances in like really clinical, harsh, unfriendly settings, and then not having the best outcomes. And I guess that's one of the things that's really, really interesting. From a certain perspective, you could say you have full control over the setting, right? You're creating this setting. But, and you mentioned this, there's a lot of challenges there. I guess, back to the photorealism idea, and do you hit an uncanny valley? And would like the synthetic environment suddenly feel really uncomfortable? Like, speaking of Michael Palin, is that how you say his name? I always forget how to pronounce it. Pollan, sorry. He talked about in that book how one of the experiences he took, I forget which it was, maybe it was mushrooms, but the person was playing new age music with synthesizers, and the kind of like syntheticness of the synthesizers colored his whole experience, and he was in this like nightmare artificial landscape that he hated. And one of the things that, and I don't know what the solution is here, but I guess from experience and being your guinea pig on a few things, that a VR headset, at least with the current resolutions, you can see that it's a screen, right? You can see the grid lines, you can see that it's a screen. So you're not fully immersed in that world. And I was just curious, like, what's your current feeling on that? Like, will you ever be able to erase that barrier to make it feel like you are immersed in a setting? Or do you just kind of embrace the artificiality of it as an opportunity to create more fantastical things? Because you mentioned the hardware limitations as kind of one of the driving factors of the aesthetics of Visitations, but I've never known you to seek photoreal. I've always known you to sort of seek a more artistic interpretation. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that problem.
So I guess you have to design around what medicine you're going to take, and also like how much you're going to take, because different, like, tuning experience is really important. So some people are going to love that 80s synthesizer music, and that's going to be the shaman and the musician that they're going to want to go hang out with, whereas other people prefer Ikaros and doing things more traditionally. And everybody has their tastes and proclivities, so it's like there isn't going to be a one size fits all. I think that's something that these pharma companies would like, because they, when they come out with these new medicines, they're also going to have protocols for administering them. So I think that they do want them to be somewhat standardized, but something that's easy to change for different people is music. So in terms of designing with different substances in mind, I don't think VR is very good for mushrooms or for tryptamines, at least not for high doses. I think the artificiality of the screen does become like very apparent, and I have not I haven't seen much in the way of research with like VR and things that are not ketamine. But ketamine in particular, actually, some people have told me that it actually gets rid of the pixels, and it actually makes VR more immersive. So it actually, like, whatever is dimensional about VR, the ketamine actually makes it more dimensional and more immersive, and you're more inside of it. And ketamine also is not particularly visual in the same way that psilocybin is, for instance. So psilocybin, you're going to see things if you open your eyes. If you're doing enough, like, there's going to be patterns. Like, it makes anything visual like much more intense, and that's not so much the case with ketamine. So visuals with ketamine actually kind of I think enhance the experience. Like, it can actually make it a bit more intense and can kind of bring it in the direction of something that's more like a classical psychedelic. So I think that's a good point. It's like you have to design around like whatever the particular substance is. And Atai, for instance, has something like 15 different drugs in the pipeline, and they're all going to need like different settings.
Was that the group that was doing like the AI to synthesize everything, or was that another company? Wasn't someone just trying to synthesize?
That was a different company.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that one was called. I think that was April 19th. April 19th project. That's Bicycle Day, right? 419.
I believe that is
that's right.
correct.
Yeah, I think they named it after that. So yeah, that one's actually pretty interesting. They're basically designing substances on a computer and kind of like testing them in a synthetic brain, more or less. And they sort of, through their tool, they were able to recreate some large number of Shulgin's substances. And they have like designs for a lot of other substances that they think will do something, but now they actually have to go through and like do all the chemistry to create those chemical structures.
So maybe we should have a last couple of questions. I'm going to jump in with one, but I'm sure Scott has a million that he can follow up with you. But then I feel like you should save some for when you're here.
Yeah.
But I'm going to come back to that privacy thing you touched on briefly, and what have you thought about the issues of having these experiences in VR, and all of this data is being gathered by the not just you but the company that's making this, the headsets, and it's not clear how they would use it, but it is clear that it is sort of data that's connected to your health, or connected to your sort of personal state of well-being, and are there most laws about medical privacy were made well before like any technology existed, including email practically. But I'm curious if there are conversations around sort of there is potentially this therapeutic sort of aspect of these new technologies, and how do we protect the data and the patient, or the people experiencing this?
Yeah, I mean, nobody that I'm working with is considering using Meta headsets, and that's part of the reason. They're also not as interested in enterprise customers. So there are headsets that you can get that are not connected to a metaverse and will never be connected to a metaverse. So they're basically just another peripheral. So they're it's like the metaverse is not the only option. And aside from that, it's really HIPAA is the thing. So Scott and I had a lot of back and forth with one client that was very interested in trying to be HIPAA compliant, and you need a specialist for that. It is kind of a complicated space. But yeah, like your biometrics should absolutely be protected. Like people should not be able to like go into your database and see what your heart rate was, whether it was collected from a VR headset or whether it was collected from any other kind of device. So I think I would assume that HIPAA would cover VR experiences as much as anything else. So, and it's the tools are all the same. It's like the databases are the same and everything like that. So yeah, every client that I'm working with is being very mindful of that.
I have maybe one question to kind of close out, and you alluded to it a little bit, is to kind of talk about the tools, and especially like how they have evolved in recent years. So you did mention Unity, you mentioned a few different headsets, and just I'm curious about like when you talked about Cosmic Sugar, you were talking about your process there and the compute shaders. And so if you could just talk briefly about the tools, how you build it, what's the hardware, what's the software?
Yeah, I've always had a strong interest in mobile VR because I like being able to put a headset in a bag. I like that they are much easier to distribute and share. If you make something for mobile VR, it's easier to, like, you can put it on a PC, not so easy to do it the other way. And I kind of like how annoying it is. It's like a little bit of a puzzle to figure out how to make things look the way that you want with those limitations. So right now I'm using a Quest for most of my development, because it's like it's mobile, it's 3DoF, it's 6DoF, and I can connect it to my PC for working in Unity. Everything that I've done has been in Unity for the most part. And I do a little bit of work with compute shaders that's in Visitations, and that's some of what we can talk about when I am in Portland. And lately I've been working with a Flow headset, so like these guys. So maybe I'll bring one out because they're so tiny. So HTC is very interested in people using that headset in the mindful space. And then I think I mentioned that HP Reverb 2 Omnicept Edition has all of these things made specifically for mindfulness and healthcare. So there are a number of VR manufacturers that do have their eye on that space.
Okay, I lied. I do have one more question. And so this one can be the closing one, because I am, okay, let me make sure that this is actually the last question. Okay, I think it will be, because this can be our closing question, because this is actually something, as you mentioned, I've worked with you a lot on some of these projects or projects parallel to these in similar spaces. And we've been working together on a lot of VR projects for 7 years or so. And something I'm increasingly believing, at least for my own preference, is that the big push for a lot of the VR headsets of this generation was like, you are going to go into VR and you're going to take your body with you. Like, so we have the lighthouses, we have inside out tracking, we have hand tracking, we have all of these things. You had all of the ridiculous things like treadmills and all those things that never really caught on. But it seemed like there was a core conceit that's like, oh, if I'm taking my eyes and my ears, I'm going to take my body with me. And I feel like for my personal, I've kind of shifted on that a lot, where I sort of feel like, actually, if I'm going into VR, I'm going to leave my body. My body's kind of irrelevant. It's just a limitation. And I've only arrived at that recently, but it feels like you sort of intuited that a bit earlier in talking about the spa and, how you could be totally passive, no interaction, and just kind of gaze and look around. And so I've been thinking a lot more, because my personal opinion is, for the current state of the technology, everything from the neck up in VR is quite good. Like, we're very good at good, immersive, responsive graphics with high density, high pixel density, high refresh rate screens. We have good spatial audio. Everything from the neck down continues to be bad, and everything from the waist down continues to barely exist. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because I feel like I've arrived to the point that I don't want to go into VR from the neck down at this point.
I mean, it has to come back from like what the needs of the experience are. So the needs for Visitations in particular are about, separating you from yourself and putting you in another space. Like, you want to be able to forget about your body. It's like, if your body's in pain or your body's in a place where you don't want it to be, the best thing you can do is just like become a floating consciousness. It's like, VR is like an amazing way to give people out of body experiences. And, because Visitations was not made to, can you use the word skeuomorphic in terms of avatars, like having a physical body?
But embodied.
So, we don't need to, it just didn't need that. So I think that whereas if you wanted to train people how to do surgery in VR, like you need your body in there. So I think it's really like, it comes down to like, what are the needs? But I do remember in the early days of VR, there were lots of experiences where you didn't need to have an avatar. But if you look down, there was like the disembodied like corpse, like somehow, where it's like there were some like early VR projects where you look down and there was like, you could see like the meat where like the neck was. If you remember that one, that square pusher video from early on. So you don't see as much of that anymore. I think like, Half-Life Alyx, you're just hands, right? It's like you don't need a body. So I think like,
I also appreciate that, because often when people include a body without understanding sort of the physics of the real world, VR ends up being this very lurchy, unpleasant experience, because not everybody's, you can't just pick the typical, like the physics is constant, but how people's bodies react to it is different. And so not including the body actually makes it a much more, I think, effective and calming and interesting experience.
Yeah, I think, there are a lot of assumptions about VR from early on, like, maybe cuts wouldn't work, but cuts work kind of fine. It's like, you can like, that's how the best teleportation is. I think it's just like, you click a place and like you snap and you're there. And like in the early days of VR, everybody was like, whoa, you don't want to cut because that's going to mess with people. But it turns out that's fine. I think in the same way, it's like early days of VR, everybody was like, well, if you can't see your body, it's going to be really weird and disorienting. But it turns out it's fine. So we're learning as we go.
Okay, well, I think I have a million more questions, but I can wait till you're here. And hopefully there will be a chance to do a Visitations demo. But as you said, it is available on some platforms. Is there a desktop version at all?
Yeah, it's on Steam.
Okay, so maybe we can put it on one of the lab computers. So if you come to the SETI lab, you can try it out. So,
cool. Right. If everybody can bring in their own VR headsets, we can do a group
session. Yeah, everybody who has VR headsets. Okay, I think that is all.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. This was really great. And we're looking forward to having you do. For those of you watching, David's going to be here in Portland doing some amazing workshops next week. So keep track of those. Follow the YouTube, but also sort of follow the SETI Eventbrite to sign up or join our Discord for the conversation. But thank you, David.
Thank you so
And
much.
Scott and Nathan, who's lurking and been streaming.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Nathan.